Climate change is here. It's happening. And the Senate Budget Committee is shining a spotlight on the immense costs that it is imposing on American families and businesses and communities, and on the looming risks to our very economy.
Let's, I think, be clear, the climate crisis is here, it's expensive, and that is just the plain truth.
Over the past year, the Senate Budget Committee has showcased the testimony of experts, scientists, economists on what's coming for us and what we have to look forward to if we don't act on climate now.
In 2022, NOAA calculated 18 separate weather and climate disasters that cost the United States at least $1 billion.
I have no question about the impact of climate change. It's going to be significant, devastating in some areas more than others.
Climate risk is better described by the title of the latest Oscar winner. It's everything, everywhere, all at once.
Over the past year, the Senate Budget Committee has showcased the warnings of what is already here and what is coming at us if we don't act on climate. The most dangerous risks are called systemic, meaning that they will cascade out into the broader economy as the mortgage problem did in 2008.
Witnesses have warned that sea level rise and wetter, more intense storms could eventually make more than $1 trillion of coastal real estate uninsurable and therefore unmortgageable, leading to a crash in coastal property values.
Certain financial instruments, such as insurance contracts and mortgages, that directly or indirectly price weather-related risks are highly exposed to climate change.
Across the country, we have found 14% of residential properties, 20% of commercial properties, 23% of all roads, and 25% of all critical infrastructure that are all risk of flooding and becoming impassable.
Most mortgages in the United States are 30-year loans. In areas where sea level rise may make homes uninhabitable in 30 years or less, lenders may become reluctant to offer 30-year mortgages.
A study published just 2 weeks ago estimates flood risk in real estate markets, showing them overvalued now by $237 billion. The coastal real estate values may plummet.
As a result, even homeowners on high ground who avoid direct damage may suffer losses as community services deteriorate and businesses are forced to relocate, taking employment opportunities with them.
You can't build an island in the middle of the ocean. So we are looking at some major changes in the future to what our community looks like. You know, not only moving that facility, but also potentially buying out properties and moving the people away from harm.
Yet another insurance provider preparing to pull out of the Sunshine State. The move by Farmers Insurance potentially affecting thousands of policyholders.
It comes as the state deals with a crumbling insurance market crisis.
We've heard testimony about how climate change is increasing the intensity of wildfires, just as more frequent flooding and more intense weather events threaten coastal property. More intense wildfires could result in a similar death spiral for Western property values in fire-prone areas.
You know, climate change really means devastating wildfires are quickly becoming the new normal. We have seen that in my home state of Washington, and we know that that comes at a real cost.
Today, 71 million properties out of 143 million are at risk of wildfire.
These fires are not your grandfather's fires. They are bigger, they're hotter, they're more powerful.
Structural losses will continue to accelerate, threatening residential insurance markets and through them, residential real estate markets.
Because the reality is that the wildfires of 2020, California's worst wildfire year on record, will pale in comparison to the wildfires of 2030 or 2040, unless we change our practices.
Just this year, Hawaii experienced the deadliest wildfires in the US in a century. Parts of Louisiana burned at an unprecedented scale. And wildfires in Canada blanketed the US in hazardous smog for weeks. From coast to coast, major insurers are raising rates and pulling out of states on the front line of climate risk.
Recently, insurance industry giants Allstate and State Farm announced they will no longer issue new policies in California, saying that increasing wildfire risks make the nation's most populous state too expensive to cover.
Insurance market withdrawals can cause ripple effects that endanger entire communities and create a downward spiral that's difficult to emerge from.
When insurance companies pull out entirely, it's the taxpayer that ends up picking up the bill. Isn't that right?
That's exactly right, Senator.
Uninsurability leads to unmortgageability. And we saw in 2008 what happens when mortgage markets crash. The writing is on the wall for a climate change-fueled repeat.
Just as the pandemic wreaked havoc throughout our supply chains, climate change is poised to do the same, only likely much more frequently. In fact, it has already begun.
While the network of global trade routes may appear robust from the outside, supply chains are vulnerable to the physical effects of climate change. And as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, when supply chains were disrupted, there was a sharp increase in global commodity prices. Evidence from past events shows that major damage to ports across the world from climate-related hazards is already occurring, and such impacts are projected to increase in the future due to cascading climate risks.
The effects of climate change on supply chains will only get worse. More bottlenecks and backlogs, more delivery delays and empty shelves, higher prices, climate-driven disruption causing climate-driven inflation.
Anticipating and adapting to the challenges of climate change will require a whole-of-nation effort focused on supply chain resilience.
The added costs of climate change now have a seat at kitchen tables around the world.
Infrastructure is the foundation of our economy and allows our society to function. But storms, floods, fires, and extreme heat mean more wear and tear on our critical infrastructure and higher costs on everything from initial construction to lifetime maintenance. It's climate disruption causing climate inflation.
I firmly believe that these storm events are going to be more frequent and they're going to be more severe.
Unfortunately, the United States is grossly behind in the codification of climate-sensitive design and engineering standards. As this country embarks on a new era of infrastructure investment, we have to ask ourselves some difficult questions. Are we designing today's infrastructure to handle tomorrow's load and tomorrow's environmental demand?
Climate affects the existing infrastructure, the main road into the Norfolk Naval Base, our bridges, and when there's damage to that infrastructure, we've got to rebuild.
The failure to recognize and account for these costs will not only undermine our reliability of our infrastructure, it will undermine our global economic competitiveness.
In Texas, Oregon, and Utah, intense heat is buckling roadways. In Chicago, Seattle, and other major cities, bridges are being doused with water to keep heat from warping the metal. Coastal areas suffer erosion, saltwater intrusion, and flooding.
Unpredictable weather has always been a challenge to raising crops and livestock, but climate change is making it even harder and more expensive for farmers, which is also driving up food prices for consumers.
Nobody is impacted more by what's happening on the weather from the climate crisis than farmers.
We are experiencing broken weather records most years, potentially multiple, and records may be broken by large amounts. It may be from flooding, snow, cold, hot, dry, winter derechos, summer derechos, and all things in between.
And this year, agricultural insurance payouts skyrocketed, costing taxpayers, and crop yields were down, raising costs for farmers and for consumers.
We know across the globe the climate crisis has slowed the growth of agricultural productivity. And meeting with farmers around the world, I've certainly had those conversations. Extreme weather events destroying crops with alarming frequency.
But what we've also seen as a result of climate, Mr. Chairman, is the forests are drier longer. Once you have an episode like that, or it's so dry that all the good stuff dries up and is not holding the dirt back anymore, what a normal rainfall can be turns into a 100 or 500 year episode. And right now we're seeing farmers, producers all over New Mexico that are impacted by what I just described.
Our farmers are really hurting as a result of loss of groundwater, which isn't recharged as fast, less spring melt-off, so there's less water, less rain, severe drought.
As climate change makes farming and raising livestock even more unpredictable, costs will continue to grow. In addition to climate-caused inflation and the mounting systemic risks, the effects of the climate crisis on our nation's public health are dangerous and costly to families, to businesses, and to the federal government.
Healthcare costs related to combustion of fossil fuels have been estimated to total nearly $820 billion in the United States annually. Over the 10-year budget window, that's over $8 trillion.
We see climate change acting to impact our health through many different mechanisms. So increasing temperature in and of itself has increasing health harms, but at the same time it increases levels of PM 2.5 and air pollution, which are toxic when we breathe them in and cause airway inflammation.
Warming climates expand disease vectors northward. particularly insects that carry diseases like Lyme disease, West Nile virus, dengue fever, and Zika. Climate change is a multiplier, both of illness rates and economic disparities. As a result, it will worsen economic inequality and widen gaps in health outcomes and life expectancy between poor and wealthy.
Urban heat islands are hyperlocal pockets of elevated temperatures within a city that can exacerbate adverse health outcomes. Residents inside Baltimore's urban heat islands are more likely to be people of color, low income, and live shorter lives.
Extreme temperatures are becoming more frequent and severe, and it's already costing lives and livelihoods. So what's derailing climate action? A decades-long, fossil fuel-funded climate obstruction campaign. This year, the Budget Committee spotlighted how secretive fossil fuel money is exposing us to environmental, economic, and budgetary catastrophes.
In recent years, we have witnessed a striking evolution of the methods used to deceive people about the harmful effects of fossil fuels. From the mass marketing of false climate solutions and net zero commitments, to the capture of critical climate negotiations like COP. It illustrates how fossil fuel money is linked to the deployment of hundreds of front groups across the country, as well as sophisticated bot networks, fake social media accounts, and hacking operations targeting climate activists.
The fossil fuel industry and its allies have spent billions of dollars in false advertising, misleading marketing, and lobbying designed to confuse the American people about the scientific facts of climate change and to prevent the adoption of meaningful solutions.
But members of Congress and the state legislators and governors and even presidents know that if they cross the fossil fuel industry and offend those special interests, they will be hit with massive attack ads that could very well deny them re-election.
Fossil fuel companies and interests are not engaging in disinformation solely in order to sell more products. They are using these tactics in bad faith to interfere with matters of policy.
The fossil fuel industry's disinformation campaign has even penetrated right into our hearing room.
The so-called climate crisis isn't what it used to be.
Natural disasters going down over the last 22 years.
So, as recently as 2020, you've said there's no consensus among scientists about climate science.
I don't even understand what, I didn't say that.
Actually, you did. It was in a document called A Critique of the House Republican Climate Policy Proposals. So, is it still your testimony that there actually is a lack of warming?
We haven't seen any
lack of warming.
Further increases beyond 2016.
There has been basically a 5-fold decrease since the 1980s in the relative impact of extreme weather.
Republican witnesses appearing before the committee from the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and the Competitive Enterprise Institute have collectively received over $500 million from fossil fuel-related interests. And that's only the money we know about.
We protect the privacy of our donors, whoever they are.
And their long-time efforts and overwhelming financial influence using dark money has cost us precious, precious time.
Their lies have cost trillions of dollars in damages. Their lies have cost lives.
Over the past year, the Senate Budget Committee has showcased the testimony of experts, scientists, economists on what's coming for us and what we have to look forward to if we don't act on climate now. The damages of climate change have been predicted for a long time, and they're here now, and they're piling up faster than even the scientists predicted. If you care about inflation, you better care about climate inflation. If you care about financial emergencies, you better care about climate financial emergencies. And if you care about the federal debt and deficit, you'd better care about climate change.